One of the things that was well covered by the mainstream media about your report were two maps that you sort of, I'm going to call them daydreaming maps, sort of blue skying or scenario maps.
Scenario, yeah.
Yeah, get the juices flowing, start talking it out about what Alberta and Saskatchewan could look like if they did have access to the sea. And we'll put those up on the screen. They're similar looking. One of them is more angular than the other. And these were widely derided by Toronto know-it-alls. And at first it's sort of startling to look at those, and then the next instinct is, well, maybe that part of BC doesn't want to join Alberta, maybe that part of Manitoba doesn't want to join Saskatchewan, although immediately anyone who knows those areas know they would be culturally pretty good fit. I think more parts of the BC interior would probably want to join BC. I tell you, go just a little bit over the Rocky Mountains, they're like Albertans there. But you also show a map of what the provinces were like before. I mean, the delineation, the borders of Canadian provinces have not always been what they are. Provincial boundaries, territorial boundaries, they changed. We even created a whole new territory about 20 years ago. So this is actually not as radical as the naysayers would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when you look at the two scenarios, which I proposed in the paper, one was based on a parallel-based new boundary, which follows the 54th and the 58th parallels, which would be in line with what we see the border is between Alberta and Saskatchewan. And then the other one, which I would think is more economical, is a infrastructure-based boundary. And so, these are two options, obviously, and depending on how you wanted to redraw the borders, if you will, they would follow the suit. Now, the reason why, I think, if you look at it along the geometrical lines, which is really how Alberta and Saskatchewan came to be back in the day in 1905 when they sat down in Ottawa and literally sat down and drew them. There was no consideration back then about where these provinces were going to be in 150 years later or 115 years later. And in fact, when you read the transcripts out of the House back then, the politicians and the leaders of the day, they were more concerned about making Alberta and Saskatchewan equiproportionate in terms of land mass out of the districts that you see from the 1895 map. Then they were worried about economic rights or future economic rights of these two economic powers. And over the last 115 years, is very clear that Alberta and Saskatchewan are now economic powers, and they're being held in place by their coastal neighbors. And so, I think if we examine the maps, and again, as you quote the people that are naysayers, our boundaries have always been in flux. Part of the paper was to re-examine how easy it is to move a boundary. And in fact, when you go through the history of the boundaries of Canada, the internal boundaries, most of them are quite easily moved. In fact, they're moved by orders in council. They get together, they'll negotiate, the boundary, and if that's not acceptable, then it was turned over, let's say, to a tribunal. It was decided, order in council, and the new boundary was drawn. So I think, unfortunately, in our day and age, you can't really do much justice in a 280 character tweet when half of it's emojis. But I think if people take the time to actually read through the paper and the scenarios, they'll see that it's quite doable. It's extremely possible. And as you said before, if you're sitting in downtown Victoria, the people that need to make the decision are the people in northern BC, not the people sitting in downtown Victoria. Same thing. The people in northern Manitoba need to make the decision rather than the people sitting in downtown Toronto. Yeah. And so I think what we need to take away from this paper is, as you said, start the conversation around perhaps the borders as they were drawn 115 years ago, dealt with the issue of 1905, which are not the issues of 2020.
That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show, which is a show I do every day. I do a monologue, interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. But you've got to subscribe to it, which you can do at premium.rebelnews.com.